An Air India flight from Hong Kong to Delhi caught fire. Moments after landing at the Indira Gandhi International Airport, the aircraft, an Airbus A321 operating as AI-315, had just completed a long-haul journey when the Auxiliary Power Unit or APU ignited.
The airline is saying there were some damages to the aircraft. However, passengers and crew remain safe. They have disembarked normally.
As passengers began to disembark, the onboard safety systems automatically shut down the APU. All passengers and crew exited safely. But this wasn't a one-off scare. This fire marks the third serious incident for Air India in just 48 hours.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Well, you didn't miss here the third Air India incident in 48 hours. And obviously this doesn't include Flight 171. So what do you think? Maybe Air India do need to take a long, hard look at themselves, and how about also a long, hard look at Flight 171, a critical look? Well, let's do that right now.
Mayday, 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 no power, no thrust, going down. That was the last thing Sumit Sabharwal, the pilot of the ill-fated Air India flight, communicated to the ATC. Then there was no further communication. Sumit Sabharwal and Clive Kundar were in command of flying that Boeing Dreamliner.
Air India have apparently just completed a big inspection of all their craft in terms of these fuel switches, which is why it's so ironic that all of these incidents are happening right now. You'd think the vigilance would be at a peak and that the safety would have increased, not decreased of late. Air India has found no faults with the fuel switches of its Boeing fleet, the airline said on Tuesday, adding to mounting evidence that the pilots killed in the crash were to blame. That's according to the Telegraph. And you might even say that is a kind of hand-wringing where they're saying there's nothing wrong with our fleet, look to the pilots. And of course, those pilots are deceased. Now, it's interesting that Air India are basically saying there's nothing wrong with our planes given the context of these three incidents in 48 hours. Some are taking that to mean, well, then it has to be the pilots. But I think as these incidents show, it can also be other factors. Whether one of the incidents occurred in a weather-related scenario and another seemed to be a technical issue.
The day before, a Kochi-Mumbai flight veered off the runway while landing. Images show significant damage to the engine casing and visible marks on the tarmac. Hours later, a Delhi-Kolkata flight aborted takeoff at a speed of 155 km per hour due to a technical fault discovered at the last second.
The airline carried out inspections and found no problems with the locking mechanism of the fuel control switch of all Boeing 787 and 737 aircraft in its fleet, a spokesperson said. The captain of the crashed jet is likely to have cut off the fuel supply before the plane went down in Ahmedabad, US officials believe. But now this isn't seeming to be an isolated incident. It seems like there's a pattern, perhaps ongoing safety violations. In other words, it's not an accident if it's an accident waiting to happen. And how would pilots feel about a situation like that?
These incidents come amid a growing cloud of concern around Air India's safety record. According to the Civil Aviation Ministry, the airline has received 9 notices in 6 months for 5 separate safety violations.
And obviously, we are dealing with peak summer season. They're very busy at this point. And so is business and profit incentives, are they clouding safety protocols? Now, coming back to Flight 171, what's quite interesting is what the eyewitnesses said on the ground about where this plane landed and what they felt about the pilots.
There, eyewitnesses in that particular locality can't thank the pilot enough because they feel that the open area just next to the BJ Medical College is what the pilot targeted when he realized that he had no thrust, no power, and the plane was crashing. The only thing left for him to do then was to look for minimum casualties on the ground when his plane crash landed. So these eyewitnesses in the Meghani Nagar area next to the BJ Medical College feel that the pilot did his best to avoid the residential buildings as well as the Ahmedabad Civil Hospital and instead land the aircraft in that open area.
Well, I'm not sure if I agree with that because ultimately the plane landed slap bang in the middle of a building and people on the ground did die. So I'm not sure if you can commend the pilots for a very good landing there. And you might say, wow, you're being hypercritical. Well, I do want to play an incredible clip where a pilot crashed a small plane with several passengers on board into a tree, and it actually led to literally everyone surviving that crash. Let's have a look.
The people who live nearby say it sounded like a semi-truck crashing on their street, plane debris on their front lawns. A small Cessna Skymaster slamming into a tree just after 8 p.m. Immediately, neighbors ran to help.
Now, this is definitely an intuitive call. If you know you're going down, where do you choose? If you know you're going to crash, where do you choose to crash? Where's the best place in terms of survivability?
Yeah, there is a downed aircraft here. Looks like shore final 2A left.
NBC 6 in Miami reports 4 people were on board, including members of a family, all with minor injuries.
There's a blessing in this that nobody was killed. And that's primarily because the plane didn't blow up.
In the footage, you can literally see neighbors using a garden hose to sort of put out the fire in the cockpit. It's pretty extraordinary. Now, I want to come back to Flight 171. According to the article, the switches were moved in succession, 1 second apart, according to the report. What I don't think the report notes is that 10 seconds later, they were turned back on again. The part that the report doesn't note is those switches were turned back on 4 seconds apart. The report doesn't say whether the switches may have been turned off accidentally or deliberately. Now, the critical issue here, besides the time period when the switches get turned off and the time period when the switches get turned back on again, and I do think one's got to imagine, is that time period something that is within the realm of human possibility? Is it possible to activate those switches in between 1 and 4 seconds? And I think the answer is yes. And so I do think it is showing sentience behind this, right? Sentience, in other words, human intentionality. Now, where the initial report does not draw any conclusion, it has raised questions about the actions of Sumit Sabharwal, the lead pilot, and Clive Kunda, the co-pilot, who had more than 19,000 hours of flying between them. This is from the Telegraph, and noted that they are including questions about both pilots, right? And so what we're seeing is the Telegraph not differentiating between both pilots, seemingly finding both potentially suspicious. I tend to differ, though.
Medical College, that black box is being scrutinized to see if there's any further detail, any cockpit conversation between the two pilots which can shed more light as to what really happened. There have been questions raised on whether the landing gear was not retracted, whether there was any kind of distraction, also whether the wing flaps were wrongly withdrawn. So was this a human error? That's also something that a lot of aviation experts are suggesting.
What is interesting, if the Telegraph is to be believed, it was the captain who issued the Mayday call. That's not something I expected. That's not actually something I knew. I only started analyzing this since the preliminary report came out. But if that's true, as far as I'm concerned, it does move the needle towards innocence, because a Mayday call is at least a real effort to try to improve the situation, unless it's merely the pretense of such an effort. And so I don't think there's any real mystery around this. Both the Telegraph and the New York Times have spoken about Captain Sabharwal issuing this Mayday call to the air traffic controller. And so that raises this question. Captain Sabharwal issued the Mayday call. Does that change anything?
Honestly, it might.
Then in a sort of postscript, right at the end of the article, the Telegraph circles back to say something they've sort of been saying all along. The Telegraph previously revealed that Air India crash investigators were examining the medical records of Mr. Sabharwal amid claims that he suffered from depression and mental health problems. Now, virtually no news has percolated to the surface regarding this. Not a single neighbor, doctor, or family member has broken their silence either to confirm or deny this. The article goes on to note Captain Sabharwal had been considering leaving the airline to look after his elderly father following the death of his mother in 2022. And then there's this statistic, which I must admit I didn't know. Did you know this crash was the first fatal accident involving Boeing's Dreamliner? Did you know the plane crash in India was the first Dreamliner crash anywhere, ever? And then the article concludes, however, the airline had suffered reputational damage after a string of safety and quality problems. And this is why many are tempted to believe Boeing is to blame, or perhaps Air India is to blame, even despite all these other craft being given a clean bill of health in terms of their switches. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that, except just to mention a aviation expert, Anthony Brickhouse, a former professor of aviation safety and accident investigation at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, who's been in the industry for the last 28 years. He spoke to people and he said a couple of things that are really worth noting, that we need to look at the pilots and look at their actions. He also says that if you turned off these switches, you would immediately get a verbal warning and you would get a whole bunch of alarms going off after cutting off the fuel. Also clarifies why being in this situation when it happened is so tricky, because turbine engines, once you cut them off, you can't just instantly turn them back on. This isn't a car or a car engine. Brickhouse told people in turbine engines they have something called spool up. The engines have to get wound up before they can produce thrust. In a situation like that, when you're heavy and you're relatively slow, you don't have time for those engines to spool back up to power. At that point, you're going down. Basically, you're a glider. And so he goes on to say, I suspect that the investigators who are inside of this know a lot more than what they're telling the general public. Well, I do too, and I think many of you suspect the same. And he goes on to say, I think they're really just trying to answer the question as to why something like this would happen. It does seem as though this particular issue, if there's an investigation around it, could actually open a can of worms. It might be something that is a lot worse than we can even imagine. The question of why, in this case, especially if it goes to motive, has to do with the machinery of the mind instead of the aircraft, which means getting to know who this pilot was. And that's not easy, and that takes time. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.